Good evening, everyone. My name is Professor Mahesh Nirmalan, and I'm the Vice Dean for Social Responsibility at the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health in the University of Manchester. And it's my privilege to welcome all of you to this year's Irene Manton Lecture, which is a lecture series which is conducted in partnership between the Linnean Society, which is one of the oldest natural societies in the United Kingdom, and the University of Manchester. The lecture series was established to commemorate and celebrate the role women have played in promoting, in developing natural sciences in the United Kingdom and beyond. And we have done this, we are quite privileged and happy that the University of Manchester has partnered the Linnean Society for 9 consecutive years, and this would be the 9th lecture in that series. As you will know, the University of Manchester has 3 main goals: research and innovation, teaching, learning, and our student experience. And the third goal, on equal footing, is our commitment to social responsibility. And this is a commitment that we take very seriously, and our global impact within this goal is very well recognized. And some of you might already know, the United Nations Strategic Developmental Goals is a key developmental agenda for the world, and our commitment to the SDGs is well recognized in the Times Higher Impact League table, where we continue to remain the first in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and second in the world. An achievement that is noteworthy and something that we are really proud of. And within this agenda, we work across multiple countries in the Global South and in the United Kingdom, and sustainability is a very key component of this agenda. And therefore, this year's Irene Manton Lecture is very relevant, and I'm really glad that Professor Julia Patricia Gordon Jones from the Bangor University is going to be delivering this lecture this year. And she will be talking about how effective are our sustainability programs. Are we meeting carbon targets? What are the challenges? Something that is very, very topical and very relevant. And I welcome you, all of you, to this lecture, and enjoy the evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening, everyone, here in the lecture theatre and at home. I don't know if I'm supposed to wave somewhere for home people, but hopefully we have also a large audience at home here. It's a delight to welcome you all and to welcome our speakers, guest speakers tonight for this 9th Irene Manton Lectures in collaborations with the Linnean Society of London. My name is Dr. Maggie Fostier, and I'm Head of Sustainability in the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health Sciences. And sorry, that's really, it's just my pleasure to be there. And tonight we're going to talk about conservation biology with Julia here. It's a topic which is really of interest to all of us. And I'm kind of hoping a tiny bit of good news will come through our way, but you know, we'll see how it goes there, because she's specialty is to measure impact of conservation efforts. Okay, I think we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a housekeeping slide. So there's no fire alarm planned. So if there are any fire alarms, we need to gather in the hall here to go to the safe space. It is all also recorded and live streamed. There will be photographs being taken. So if you do not want to be part of the photography that would then be published, please let us staff know that you do not want to take part here. There will also be question and answers at the end. We are asking you, if you can, to please ask your questions via the Slido tool. There is a code for this, so the young audience will probably be quite familiar with those type of tools. So if you just go to slido.com, you can ask your questions at any time during the event as they come to you. There is a code to enter here, and I will screen the questions to ask them live here. I think we have such a small audience, we can also take some live questions at the end. Okay. Right, so as Mahesh highlighted, the strategy for environmental sustainability at the University of Manchester is centered around the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals. There are 17 of them. We are not the only one. This is a very good framework to think of sustainability as a cross-discipline aspect, and also to try to basically save the planet without leaving anyone behind. That's really the idea behind those goals when they were set up. So this is something we have been working on at the University of Manchester for quite a long time now. And as a result, we are doing really quite well when we are ranked according to those criteria. There's 17 of them, and for the last 5 years, we have been ranking in the top 10 via the Times Higher Education Impact ranking. Lately, this is a really good one, we certainly have been first in the UK and Europe consistently, and at the moment we are a third in the world for this. This is obviously, hopefully, a positive race. You know, we are competing positively on this one, but we are really proud of our efforts here. And the ones that we are focusing on tonight a bit more would be life on land, and I'm sure on water as well here. Right, without further ado, first we're going to talk about the Linnean Society with its vice presidents. So we have Robbie Blackhole Miles here, which I have the delight to meet for the second time. And it's just really nice to have him, and he's going to introduce the whole principle behind this collaboration.
So I'm actually particularly excited to be here this evening, mainly because it's Julia speaking tonight. Julia happens to not only be a colleague of mine, but also a neighbour and friend. So it was quite a nice surprise to find out that I was going to be here tonight with Julia speaking. I'm Robbie Blackhole Miles. I'm Vice President of the Linnean Society of London. The Linnean Society of London was founded in 1788, and we're the world's oldest society for the study of natural history. Our mission is to engage and ensure a world where nature is understood, valued, and protected. The Society's home to some of the world's most valuable natural history collections, not least of all the collections of Carl Linnaeus, the orator of the binomial nomenclature system, and the letters between Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, discussing their theories on evolution by means of natural selection. We're a society both for amateur and professional natural historians, and our history is entirely tied up in the history of science. Some of our most famous scientists have been people like Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, but also Robert Brown, who was the discoverer of plant cell nuclei, and one of the most famous users of microscopes. And our first women entering the society first entered the society in 1904. One of our most famous women members was Beatrix Potter, who a lot of people don't realise not only was a world-renowned author, but had a particular interest in the study of mycology and wrote papers which were presented to the Linnean Society on that study. We have had in our time since 1904 4 women presidents, and the current president of the Linnean Society, Anjali Goswami, she studies the evolution of mammals through understanding their skull evolution, and our first female president who started her career here at the University of Manchester was Irene Manton, for who this lecture is named. On the subject of Irene Manton, we have a range of different medals that we award, one of which is considered the top medal in the world for the study of natural history and natural sciences, which is the Linnean Medal. But we also have the Irene Manton Prize, which is for the best PhD botany thesis. And of course, Irene Manton was a pteridologist who studied ferns. We also have 6 different grants that we award each year, mostly for PhD research in specialist subjects in the natural sciences. And we are based at Burlington House in Piccadilly in London, where you can view all of our collections, see those amazing letters, see the history of the Society by appointment at the moment, but hopefully in the near future we're going to have a more open door policy for you to be able to visit us in London. And I would just like to say that we can be found on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And our YouTube channel is really worth a watch. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And that's the Linnean Society. I am introducing you. And I'd really like to introduce Julia.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you absolutely for being here. I know how hard it is to sort of, when things are available online, it's very easy to just stay at home and do your washing up while watching it in the background. So those of you that have made the effort to come to the room, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about, is conservation working? Now, it's hard for me to know what this audience is. I expect most people here have quite a strong interest in nature and biodiversity conservation. But I'm going to start with quite a broad framing in case we've had some people that have wandered in off the streets and aren't that aware of biodiversity loss. So I was thinking how best to communicate just how bad biodiversity loss is if we have a kind of audience that aren't yet convinced it's a problem. And there's so many different statistics that we could use, but I'm going to use the biomass of mammals on the planet. So imagine we got all the mammals together and weighed them, and each of the blocks I'm going to show is 1% of the world's mammals by weight. So if we just had camels, sheep, goats, horses, and a few donkeys, we'd get to 10%. When we add in the pigs, the buffaloes, and a few cows, we quickly get to 30%. This is of all the mammals on the planet. There's way more cows than that. Quickly, we're now up to 64% of the world's biomass just as cows. That's not me, it's you. But we're also mammals, and there's a lot of us, and some of us weigh quite a lot. And so when you add up all of the mammals on the planet, all our livestock, all of us, everything domestic and human, that's 96% of the biomass of mammals on this planet, leaving just 4% for everything wild. That's the whales, the elephants, but it's also the badgers, the foxes, the pine martens, the hedgehogs, the tiger antelopes, the dolphins, whatever it might be. That's a pretty shocking statistic. It can be hard, I think, to me it puts that in context very well, just how little there is in the way of wild species left. Oh, there you go, there's a call there. Who knows what that call is? Anyone other than Robbie, who spent a long time studying them? What's that? It is a bird. Fantastic. What kind of bird is it? No, actually, that's a curlew. So just another way of kind of pointing out the loss of biodiversity. Just in the time since I started training to be an ecologist, the populations of curlews in the UK has declined by more than half. Much more than probably about nearer 70 to 80% in Wales, where I live. So that's 50 or 70% fewer opportunities for kids growing up today to hear that wonderful call of the curlew that inspired me as a child to get interested in nature. So my aim from that introduction is both using kind of global statistics but also something a bit more personal, just to point out that biodiversity loss really is real. Nature is not in a good state. But people around the world are coming together and doing things to improve the state of nature. So whether it's, I don't know, in preparing this lecture, I went on the local Wildlife Trust website, because that's always a good place to start for looking for action for nature. The Wildlife Trusts are a fantastic group of organisations. There's also internationally, there's policymakers working hard to agree targets to try and improve the way in which nations work together to improve the state of nature. We've got campaigners and protesters doing their bit to fight for nature. There are people out there at all scales in all parts of the world trying to make a difference for nature, trying to tackle that biodiversity loss. But is it working? That's the fundamental question. Now, that's the question that I've been trying to answer. The main focus of my research over the last decade or so has been, is what we're doing to slow biodiversity loss making a difference? Now, at its heart, that's a question of causal inference. We're trying to tease apart, in a complex, messy world, the impact of a specific intervention and say, has a change that we can see in this system, has it happened because of, in this case, our conservation intervention? Now, that whole area of causal inference has been a major field of study over the last couple of decades. There's actually been 2 Nobel Prizes for economics offered, firstly for work trying to do causal inference using large-scale, landscape-scale experiments in development economics in that case. But more often and more relevant to conservation is trying to do causal inference just from observational data where we can't do experiments. So in the sort of messy realities of the world where there's been conservation in some areas and not in others, can we tease apart an impact of protection, of conservation? And there was a Nobel Prize for the underlying maths for that kind of causal inference very recently. And that work has revolutionized fields as diverse, policy-relevant fields as diverse as development spending, welfare spending, early years education. And just in the last decade or so, it's really started to impact biodiversity conservation. So, and that's the kind of work I've been doing, which is trying to understand, does conservation work? So the key idea in all of this is the idea of a counterfactual. So the key concept for impact evaluation is the counterfactual. That is, what would have happened if your intervention didn't happen? Now, whatever physicists tell us about multi-universes or things like that, in any meaningful sense, we only have one universe. So it's impossible to compare the universe in which your conservation intervention happened with a world in which everything's exactly the same apart from the conservation intervention. That's the problem. So the counterfactual is inherently unknowable. We can never know what would have happened if the conservation hadn't happened. That's the problem. That's what we're trying to get at in impact evaluation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask 2 questions in this talk, 2 quite applied questions that we care about from a conservation perspective. And I'm going to use a couple, in each case, a couple of examples of my own work where we've been trying to use counterfactual impact evaluation approaches to evaluate whether or not conservation works. Firstly, looking at protected areas, and secondly, looking at biodiversity offsetting. So, first of all, are protected areas effective? The world environmental kind of policy community heaved a big sigh of relief last November or so when the Global Biodiversity Framework was finally signed by the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that was the Kunming-Montreal Agreement last year, and it was the kind of final moment of a decade or so of, no, not quite that long, so 5-6 years of policy effort to agree the next sort of a roadmap for the next 10 years of how countries are going to work together to conserve biodiversity. And one of the most high-profile targets within the Global Biodiversity Framework is what's become known as 30 by 30. So that's the idea that we need to conserve 30% of the planet for nature by 2030. And that's a big expansion from where we're at now. We're currently at about 17% of the Earth's area and about 8% of terrestrial area, about 8% of marine area. So it's a big expansion. So given that there is all this kind of policy energy around expanding protected areas, it seems important to know, have protected areas worked, or are they working? So I'm going to present two papers that are looking at this. Are you ladies in the back all right? There's just constant whispering. It's really distracting. You okay? Good. Give me thumbs up. Everything all right? Good. Excellent. Good. Just if there's anything concerning you, just feel free to interrupt me at any point, because we're a small group. We can talk very informally. Great. Okay, so what's been the impact of protected areas on trends in water birds globally? And secondly, we're going to be looking at protected area management in Madagascar and whether it has effectively reduced fires or not. So these are both very different scale impact evaluations to fundamentally ask the question, have protected areas worked or not? Okay, so what has been the impact of protected areas on trends in water birds? So water birds including my much beloved curlew I started by talking about. So to answer this question, we worked with an incredible data set, so 27,000 populations of water birds that have been counted for at least 14 years, and in many cases up to 40 years. And it's supposedly a global data set, but you can see some rather big gaps. You know, when we say a global data set, we're meaning global scale, but very heavy overrepresentation from North America and Europe, where a lot of people like counting water birds. And during that time series, about 1,500 of the sites became protected, and the rest didn't. I just want a quick shout out to anyone who's ever been involved in doing water bird counts, because that has contributed to the data. So here's some members of my research group doing their bit for WEB's counts with the BTO. Anyone here taken part in BTO monitoring schemes? Robbie, fantastic, very good. Okay, so to analyse this, we were using what we call a BACI framework. Now, economists call it difference in differences. Working with a lot of statistics in causal inference, I'm constantly having to sort of translate between ecologists and economists call the same thing something really quite different, which can be frustrating. So essentially, all we're thinking about is on the y-axis, we've got the count, the number of individuals being counted, on the x-axis, time. Imagine a population was declining, protected area came along, population started to recover. You might infer from that the protected areas had a positive impact. But using that very simple before and after framework, you can miss the obvious. For example, if you had an unprotected population that showed the same pattern, you'd immediately think, probably protection isn't having such an impact. But if that control population showed this pattern, you'd think, yes, that's stronger evidence of protection. So the BACI framework, before, after, control and intervention, allows us to take into account both the before and after analysis and comparing with a control. So what we did was globally, we matched our populations where there was a protection during the time series and compared that with where there wasn't a protection, but the sites were similar in terms of all other things that, well, as many as possible other things that protect bird populations, affect bird populations. And there's a number of different patterns that you would infer mean a positive impact of protection. I'm showing those here. You're going to be seeing a really ugly graph in a minute. So this is just getting you ready for an ugly graph. And what you need to get used to is the colours on the top. Dark blues and blues mean a positive impact of protection. And all of those patterns we would infer as being evidence that the protected area has caused a positive impact. Of course, protected areas might not be doing anything at all, and there'd be a range of patterns that we would infer from them that protection hasn't done anything. And those will come up in yellow and grey. Oh, jumped one there. Where's my red? Okay, there's a slide missing. But equally, if the protection was not having a positive impact or not having a negative impact, there'd be a range of patterns that would show that, and those would be coloured in red. This is the ugly graph. So on the x-axis, you've got the 1,500 sites that became protected during our time series. And the y-axis is the proportion of populations at each of those sites that was positively, that's blue, neutrally or negatively in red, impacted by protection. So if protected areas were having a really positive effect, you'd be seeing mostly blue on that graph, but you're really not seeing mostly blue on that graph. And in fact, somebody has, they had to sort out my slides because there was a problem with the thing, but something's definitely gone wrong with my slides. They're in the wrong order. Anyway, don't know what happened there. Doesn't matter. We'll hope for the best. I should have checked them more carefully when I came in. Okay, so if we rearrange it by species, so here we've got 150 species on the x-axis, and the proportion of sites at which those species occur, which are positively, neutrally, or negatively impacted by protection. Again, we can see there's no overwhelming pattern of blue. So it's not a very positive lesson for conservation. Protected areas, when we look at the global scale, are not having an overwhelmingly measurable positive impact on populations of species. In this case, water birds. We tried very hard when doing this analysis to use other data sets, for example, playing around for a long time with the Living Planet Index, but we couldn't find enough matches of both protected sites and unprotected sites to incorporate, so we're very limited by the data that we can include. But the reason why this is, I mean, it doesn't surprise any of us that work in conservation are not surprised by this result, because many protected areas are little more than lines drawn in on maps with very limited management on the ground. So, for example, in the UK, many of our national parks, so they count as a very low level of protection under the World Database of Protected Areas. And there's very little active management for nature across much of our protected areas. What really matters is what's happening in terms of management for nature, and I want to illustrate this with another pieces of our research. And this is looking at protected areas in Madagascar and how management and changes in management can affect outcomes for nature. I've spent much of the last 20 odd years working in Madagascar, and you can see why. There's some beautiful, beautiful animals in Madagascar. So, March 2020, think back to March 2020. The world locked down, and of course, the same went on in Madagascar. The COVID lockdowns were came in quite early in Madagascar and were very strong, so there was very little movement nationally. Most normal activities, including protected area management, kind of stopped overnight. So this was a really good opportunity to look at what normal protected area management does in terms of effectiveness for nature, because when it's interrupted, that's a kind of natural experiment that we can use. So in June 2020, a colleague of mine published a blog showing that fires were much more prevalent in Madagascar's protected areas in March to June 2020 compared to March to June 2019. But of course, you can't interpret from that simple before and after analysis that that's because of the COVID lockdowns. Because other things will have inevitably varied, the kind of things that affect fires, like rainfall, obviously. Fires in Madagascar's protected areas are super variable, both between seasons and years. So this is from the western dry forests of Madagascar. You can see fires peak in sort of October, November, so that's the end of the dry season. And both rainfall and fires are very variable year to year. That's shown by the box and whisker plot. The red dots is what happened in 2020. So we built a model using both the climate and fire data to estimate the expected burns in Madagascar's protected areas each year. So this was a kind of way of looking for excess burns over and above what we would expect based on the climate. And if you look at a normal year, there's 2012, the kind of expected fires matched observed fires. There's no excess fires, so you're within kind of the black line doesn't get outside the confidence intervals around 0, essentially. Except, there was a couple of periods where you did get excess fires before 2020. And what's interesting, if I do this to a Malagasy audience, immediately a Malagasy audience know what happened in October to December 2013. It was a very highly contested election, but I wouldn't expect this audience to know. And it's quite interesting that that came out in our data, because it is well known that in countries with relatively sort of weak natural resource governance, contested elections are often associated with increases in illegal exploitation, such as land clearance within protected areas. So that's quite interesting. It kind of reassures us that the model's picking up something real. But nothing in our data set came close to what happened in 2020. So March to July 2020, fires were way higher than they were any other time, over and above what we'd have expected from rainfall. And what's interesting is they went back to normal very quickly after normal protected area management resumed in sort of July 2020, whereas the economy of Madagascar didn't start to recover, the country didn't open for tourism, the protected areas didn't reopen for more than a year after that. So it's quite a nice kind of natural experiment, as I say, to show what an interruption to normal management does. And it's a useful reminder that management really does make a difference. So if we're looking for positive messages, I mean, Maggie asked me, we had a drink beforehand, and she said, I hope it's going to be a good story. So I'm sort of scraping the barrel a bit, but let's look out for good stories. You know, there is a good story in here, which says that, you know, yes, Madagascar's protected areas may face many, many challenges. There's many, you know, difficulties going on in protected area management in Madagascar, as in many other parts of the world, including here in the UK. But protected area management is making a difference. And if you withdraw what's going on, that's not good. So protected area management matters. So overall, are protected areas effective? Well, at the global scale, on average, they're not doing brilliantly. But that masks lots of, you know, what counts as protected varies massively from place to place. And the sort of, when we look at things in the global average, you're obviously going to be mixing together protected areas with very little active management on the ground, with protected areas where some really great stuff is going on. And so that kind of global analysis, although it's a rather depressing finding, it shouldn't really surprise us, because we know that protected areas vary massively in their management effectiveness and what's happening on the ground. What about here in the UK? So the UK signed up well ahead of time to the 30 by 30 pledge, so it was a good 2 or 3 years in advance of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement being signed that the UK government announced that they were going to achieve 30% of the country conserved for nature by 2030. Now, at the time, it was Boris Johnson was Prime Minister at the time, and in his kind of announcement, he claimed that we were currently at 26%. So that kind of surprised most conservationists in the UK, that we were already at 26% of the UK conserved effectively for nature. A more recent House of Lords report that came out earlier this year estimates that we're closer to 6.5% under any kind of meaningful management for nature. But they note that many of those, the quality of many of those protected areas is in doubt, and many of them are poorly monitored. So it's very clear that we have a long way to go in terms of meeting that kind of global target. Okay, so the second part of this talk, I want to focus on the concept of biodiversity offsetting. So protected areas are very much a kind of a public, government-driven approach to conservation. But increasingly around the world, there's a lot of attention given to conservation done by the private sector, often in the context of biodiversity offsetting. So just to make sure you're all familiar with this concept, just actually, can we just put up your hands? How many of you are confident, how many of you have heard of the idea of biodiversity offsetting? Most people? How many of you, if I was to put you on a spot and ask you to explain it, would feel confident to do that? I'm not going to do it, don't worry. Yeah, okay. Fewer. But anyway, so biodiversity offsetting is part of what's called the mitigation hierarchy. So this is the idea that when an infrastructure development or some kind of project, whether it's a road project or a, I don't know, HS2 railway or a mine, if it's going to damage biodiversity, so that results in a sort of negative impact for biodiversity, shown here. So the y-axis here is the state of biodiversity. So biodiversity negative impacts from a big development project. They should be avoided as much as possible. Further reduced. These have slightly different definitions, but I'm not going to go into them. As much restoration should be done as possible. But if there's residual, unavoidable impacts of biodiversity, these should be offset to achieve, at least in theory, a no net loss of biodiversity, or, as we increasingly talk about in the UK, due to the recent biodiversity net gain law, a net gain in biodiversity. So these offsets, this final stage of the mitigation hierarchy, is biodiversity offsetting, and that's through generating off-site gains for biodiversity to offset these unavoidable losses. And these gains can be generated either through creating or restoring habitat for nature, or, and this is the most controversial, avoiding harm to nature that would have otherwise happened from an unregulated sector. That can also be used as an offset. So I'm going to, again, use two of my group's research to illustrate, to explore this question of how effective have biodiversity offsets been. It's a hugely growing, it's a large and growing approach to conservation. A review published about 3 or 4 years ago, which is the most recent, produced a database of 12,000 biodiversity offsets worldwide, and we're way, way, way higher than that now. So there's a lot of biodiversity offsetting going on in the world. So first of all, we're going to look at a major mine in Madagascar, the Ambatavi mine, and ask whether it's achieved its commitments to achieve no net loss of forest. So this is one of the biggest lateritic nickel and cobalt mines in the world. It's a $9 billion investment, slap bang in the middle of the eastern rainforests of Madagascar. Of course, these are super important sites for nature. But this mine is also important. We started today, Maggie was talking about these Sustainable Development Goals. Now, obviously a mine like this damages Sustainable Development Goal 15, life on land, but it contributes very importantly to the no poverty, end poverty goal, goal 1. Because Madagascar, a mine like this makes up nearly 20% of Madagascar's tax take. So it's hugely important in one of the poorest countries in the world. But as I say, slap bang in the middle of this forest full of wonderful biodiversity. So the mine made a very public commitment back in the day to achieve no net loss of biodiversity. So they're going to clear, or they have now cleared, about 2,000 hectares of forest in the middle of this beautiful rainforest. So that's a loss, and they need to offset that loss by generating gains for biodiversity. And they decided to do that through investing in efforts to conserve forests that would otherwise have been lost due to shifting agriculture, which is the main driver of deforestation in the eastern rainforests of Madagascar. And that's deforestation carried out by people like this, going about their day-to-day lives, clearing land for agriculture. So therefore, these offsets are what we call avoided loss offsets. They're not creating any habitat to offset their loss. They're avoiding some other loss to offset their loss. So this is one of the offset sites, the Ankerina biodiversity offset in the eastern rainforest. The dark green is forest. That's the main forest block, and there's a patch of forest off to the right, which is the Ankerina Reserve. And you can see deforestation there in the period before the offset was set up, and then that's the period after. It looks a bit like deforestation slowed within the offset, and if anything, it increased in the wider landscape. Look at that again. You can kind of see that. Oops. Now, I'm not going to tell you the analysis that we did. It's too complicated to go into now. You're going to have to trust me, or you can go and read the paper. Essentially, what we did was we, again, used statistical matching and other approaches to try and estimate a counterfactual of how much deforestation we would have expected to have happened during the period that the offset was running for, to ask, okay, so given, if we compare how much actually happened, how much has been avoided by that offset project? You can see there's a lot of caveats. Inevitably, it's challenging. There's lots of assumptions to be made, but we're skipping over all the maths. And the conclusion is that by the end of 2021, the Ambatavi offset had achieved no net loss of forest. So they had reduced deforestation enough to offset the 2,000 hectares of deforestation they'd done at the mine site. So that's kind of a positive result. I mean, to me, it's more of it would be a catastrophic result if they'd failed, because this is one of the most high-profile biodiversity offsets in the world, and one of the most intense investments in conservation that Madagascar's ever had. If that had failed to slow deforestation, we might as well all give up and go home, because conservation, if conservation can't work in that context, with that level of funding, then it's really never going to happen. But there are super important caveats to that finding, however positive it might be. I mean, we've got people joining us online, so I'm not going to do this interactively, but I'm sure I can see from some of your faces there's some real skepticism here, and you're right to be skeptical. First of all, biodiversity is not the same as forest cover. We're using the simplest metric you can imagine to measure biodiversity here, just forest cover. Biodiversity is so much more, and the company claimed they would achieve no net loss of biodiversity. We've measured no net loss of forest, different things. Secondly, given the drivers of deforestation that they were trying to slow are the main livelihood of some of the poorest people on the planet, the fact that they've managed to slow deforestation isn't necessarily good from a point of view of people. Now, the mine did invest very heavily in alternative livelihood schemes, agricultural training, agricultural extension, trying to improve settled agriculture and reduce the need for shifting agriculture. But I had a postdoc studying these biodiversity offsets for a couple of years, and our conclusions really are that unfortunately they did result in poor people being made poorer. So although there was some really good agricultural extension projects that went down really well and were really effective, they tended to only reach the more privileged, richer people, and the most remote people, the ones most affected by the restrictions, unfortunately, didn't really benefit. So overall, no net loss of forest was achieved, but some poor people got made poorer as a result. And then, as I say, my final caveat was the one I started with, really. You know, this was a really high-profile project, and Batavi sort of decided that they knew that it was going to be controversial, doing this mining in the middle of a rainforest that was so globally important. It was a World Heritage Site. They decided to kind of come out as, like, make really high-profile commitments. They chaired the Business Biodiversity Offset Partnership. They used, you know, Batavi was used as a kind of flagship project for thinking through these ideas of how offsets can work. So I worry a lot that our paper gets used by companies trying to get permission to do mining in a biodiversity hotspot and say, oh, but look, we're going to do offsetting, and this paper shows offsetting works. Well, this paper shows that this very specific case, with a huge amount of international attention and very substantial resources, did achieve at least no net loss of forest. That's not the same as showing biodiversity offsetting works. Now, I'm thinking I might skip over this example so we have more time for discussion. No, I'll do it anyway, we'll see. How are we doing for time, by the way? We're doing fine. Okay, I will do this example then. Okay, so one other biodiversity offsetting example. So the state of Victoria in Australia has one of the longest biodiversity offsetting schemes in the world. So if you're going to, I don't know, build a housing development that results in you clearing some native vegetation, you can buy biodiversity offsets to offset that native vegetation that you're destroying from an offset provider. So this is a landowner who's registered their land as a provider of biodiversity offsets, essentially. So we wanted to know, has biodiversity, however you measure it, improved on the parcels of people's land enrolled as biodiversity offsets more than it would have done in the absence of them having enrolled as an offset? Because really, that question of additionality, is there additionality in terms of in the biodiversity gains offered by the offsets, is absolutely critical for knowing whether these offsets are meaningful. Because the biodiversity loss due to development, that's very real. A patch of native vegetation is being cleared. So is it real on the other side? That was the question we wanted to ask in this study. So we took two approaches in this study to estimating the counterfactual. And this illustrates something that I think is quite important and worth trying to get your head around. So first of all, we estimated the counterfactual. So this is what would have happened on those land parcels if they hadn't become an offset. First of all, we estimated those simply by matching other land parcels in the area that were similar but weren't currently offsets. And what this graph shows is, along time on the x-axis, mean proportion of woody vegetation cover on the y-axis, and the offsets are in pink, and their matched controls are in blue. And you can see that, on average, we did see that woody vegetation cover increased in offsets more than in the counterfactual land parcels. And this is robust if you exclude a bunch of parcels that burnt in some particularly bad fires that happened, the Black Saturday fires of Victoria that happened in 2009. But there's a huge caveat here, and it really illustrates to me very well the real problem with trying to estimate these unknowable counterfactuals that we rely on in conservation impact evaluation. And that's the fact that landowners are different, and the characteristics of the type of landowner who's likely to enrol their land as a biodiversity offset is probably different from the kind of person that wouldn't have enrolled. So we need to find some way of matching genuinely like with like landowners. It's very difficult to do that. What we used as a proxy was early and late adopters, assuming that people who adopted the idea of enrolling their land as an offset early are more similar to people who did it late are more similar to people who did it early than the rest of the population in general. Obviously, early and late adopters are different, but they're more similar than people who never adopt. So in the second counterfactual, we estimated outcomes in offset parcels with outcomes that were not offsets during the time series but would later become offsets. We think that might be a better way of getting at what would really have happened on those offsets had they not been offsets. And when we do that analysis, the result becomes much, much weaker and disappears completely when we exclude the Black Saturday fires. And that's a pretty depressing story, really, because this is one of the most sort of high-profile, well-known biodiversity offset scheme, long-running sort of biodiversity offsetting schemes. And really, there's no evidence, once you look at it closely, that anything has really, any biodiversity gains have actually been generated to offset the losses that were driven because of the developments that were done and were supposedly offset. So it's a kind of depressing finding. And of course, there's a lot of debate in the UK at the moment around, or particularly in England where it applies, the new biodiversity net gain requirement, which requires a 10% net uplift improvement in biodiversity on the vast majority of development projects now require biodiversity net gain. But the key question is, well, there's two key questions. Firstly, how you measure biodiversity. The metric that's used is hotly debated, but also the extent to which these gains in biodiversity are going to be genuinely additional gains for biodiversity to offset the losses. So can offsetting slow biodiversity loss? This is one of those topics that I swing back and forth on as to whether I think it's a good idea. I think on average I am a pragmatist, and given we have a world with such ongoing biodiversity loss and development is going to happen, I kind of feel positive that investment in conservation is coming in through the private sector as a kind of, they're being required upfront to invest in conservation to offset the losses. But we mustn't kid ourselves that it's a kind of get out of jail free card and that the impact of development can just be offset. It's not that simple. That's something we can definitely chat about more in the questions. I'm sure it'll come up. So, the last few minutes, what is the time? Can someone tell me the time? 20 okay, just the last few minutes. Right, so where should we go in impact evaluation? Now, this is a technical point, but I am talking to quite a technical audience with the University of Manchester. And that's that I think those of us that do conservation impact evaluation need to be doing a lot more pre-registration of our analysis plans. So we're in a medical and health faculty as well here. The medical field is way ahead of conservation in this, which is the idea that we really need for our results to be robust, we need to be registering our planned analysis in advance. And the analogy I'm using here, I'm sure you all know your classics, an erudite audience such as this. When Odysseus wanted to hear the siren song, he asked his crewmates to tie his arms to the post at the mast on his ship so that he wouldn't be tempted to sort of swim after the sirens to his death. If you're wondering how his crew were able to row, they had beeswax in their ears. But the same way, scientists are increasingly realise that they need to be able to withstand the siren song of cherry-picking results or hypothesising after results are known. harking as it's called, we should sort of tie our arms to the mast by pre-registering our study designs. And it's really important, particularly to avoid the literature essentially cherry-picking positive results. There was a big scandal in the sort of medical world back in, it's a long time ago now, about 2008, when a study was published that showed that antidepressant drugs, drug trials, there was a massive publication bias in which ones made it into the published literature. So only trials that had shown a positive impact of a certain suite of antidepressant drugs. Those with positive results got published, those with neutral or negative results got buried, and actually if you analysed all the data together, there was no strong evidence of positive impact of those drugs for that usage. And we in conservation need to get better at pre-registering our study designs, and particularly avoiding this cherry picking of positive results. So if you, increasingly now journals accept for you to publish your work as a registered report. So you go through peer review for the study design and the introduction before you've even done your analysis. We published the first registered report in conservation. It was for a study looking at the impacts of a payment for ecosystem services scheme in Bolivia. And we had a messy study. We knew, we knew it was going to be a messy result. We had 16 different outcome variables we were interested in looking at the impact of the intervention on. And I was very worried that we were going to find some kind of negative results and positive results, maybe even some kind of results in the wrong direction than expected. And if we hadn't published that as a registered report, I'm convinced that we'd have been essentially forced to cherry pick, and the only outcomes we'd have ended up reporting in the published literature would have been the positive results. And we know that, most interventions tend to have small or neutral impacts. And if we're really serious about understanding the impacts of conservation interventions, we need to make sure that we're publishing the neutral and negative results as well as the positive results. And then the other kind of pointing to the future, ways in which we need to improve conservation impact evaluation is we do need to be doing more experiments. So I've just been talking about study designs using mostly observational data, but we can do experiments. If you look at the conservation evidence database, which any of you who work in conservation should absolutely be using whenever you want to know something about the effectiveness of an intervention, just go to conservation evidence, put it in the search bar, and you'll find all the evidence synthesized there. And if you look at conservation evidence, you will find, some studies, some interventions have been tested experimentally, but mostly not. Most study designs are observational in conservation. But I think we could be doing more experiments. I'm actually working at the moment, that's where this beautiful picture comes from. I'm working with a fantastic Comorian NGO called Dahari Comores and colleagues at the University of Oxford to run a randomised control trial looking at the impact of a new approach they're taking. We're running a randomised control trial, so a randomised experiment at the landscape scale of a new approach to conservation where they're essentially paying farmers to not chop down trees, essentially. And so we're looking at the impacts both in terms of a forest change, so we've just finished drone mapping the area and we're doing vegetation plots. We're also studying how it impacts livelihoods, some photos from our baseline survey that's actually just being rolled out as we speak. So we can do more experiments, and I think we should be doing a few more. Okay, so my penultimate slide. So I added this one in at the very last minute after Maggie said, so, she had this such a hopeful look on her face. She said, is it going to be a positive story? She's had a tough week. It's only Tuesday, but she wants a positive story. And don't we all in the world at the moment, we want a positive story. And working in conservation can be quite depressing because, biodiversity loss is ongoing and biodiversity is in a terrible state, as I started this talk with. But there are things that give me hope. So I grabbed a picture of happy Bangor University students out at Comidwala site that Robbie works at a lot. And I know it sounds trite, but that is what gives me hope. So I work with such fantastic, that's the joy of being an academic, is you get to supervise students and interact daily with young, enthusiastic people who aren't as jaded by life as some of us feel. And as I say, it's a cheesy point, but that does give me hope. There is such a movement, there is such a growth of interest, there is interest in biodiversity conservation. There's lots of people out there trying to make it work more effectively. And I think that's my hopeful message for you. So, in conclusion, conservation as a discipline is, I would say, decades really, well, at least a decade or so behind other fields of sort of applied endeavours at trying to really establish the effectiveness of what we do, what's effective and what's not. But it does feel like we're pushing at an open door now. Things are changing. There's real interest in donors that fund conservation, in knowing what works and what doesn't, and there's a huge demand for kind of robust evidence of effectiveness. And that is again a positive message, because we cannot improve the effectiveness of conservation and the better target the limited resources we have for conservation without robust impact evaluation. So thank you so much to the lead authors of all the papers I focused on, and of course all my other collaborators for the work I've presented here. And thank you for listening.
Shall we not sit there? Right. Okay, sorry. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you very much, Julia. And I want you to be realistic, obviously. So thank you very much for this talk and those nice case studies, which I think are putting the scene quite nicely. I know we have some questions on Slido, but can I just ask if the audience has some questions as well? Because, they came here. Angie, you start.
Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm just... Does this work? Yeah. Just thinking about the offsetting. If we're going to achieve 30 by 30, are we not going to have to expect more from companies that want to develop and actually demand that they contribute to rewilding and not just prevent loss that would have happened?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm still mic'd up. Okay, so it depends what... It's interesting you use the word rewilding. So rewilding is quite a kind of loaded political term. Some people love the term, some people hate the term. But at heart, it means restoration through different, whether it's passive rewilding, whether it's trophic rewilding with reintroductions. Ultimately, it's about restoring habitat and finding a way to get nature back, re-establishing lost ecological processes and functioning. And absolutely, that can be part of an offset. So an offset could be a restoration project that's done through rewilding. Absolutely, that could be the term used. Your question ultimately was, do we need to expect more from the private sector?
Just hard to see how we could reach the target of increasing our biodiversity when we are allowing them to just prevent further loss and not add to biodiversity.
Okay, so that's yes, I get your point. Okay, so in the UK context, there is no real plan for avoided loss biodiversity offsetting. In the context of the UK, where nature is so depleted, offsetting is generally through restoration, rewilding, investments in creating nature uplift. Avoided loss offsets are highly controversial, but the place they tend to be used is where there is still a very high rate of loss of very precious biodiversity. So somewhere like Madagascar, it's very hard to generate ancient rainforests in Madagascar. And the ongoing loss of those forests is such a high pressure that it's acceptable. It's seen as probably the best option to offset through investing your conservation efforts, not trying to kind of create a forest over here on some degraded land, but to try and stop the loss that's going on still high quality nature. But that's a very different context from places where nature is already highly depleted. So places like the UK, absolutely, as you say, the investments aren't in slowing loss. They're in, because there is no unregulated sector in the UK that's destroying nature. Everything is under some kind of regulation that's supposed to not destroy nature. So you don't have that unregulated sector of, so agriculture in Madagascar, Swidden agriculture by poor farmers is completely unregulated. So an industry can invest in generating biodiversity gains by investing in that unregulated, in slowing the loss of that unregulated sector. The UK, we don't have that. So you wouldn't be able to, an intensive farm or an agriculture system or a building project, or whatever it might be, can't offset by slowing a loss from an unregulated sector because it doesn't exist. So it is investment in nature creation in the UK. Oh my goodness, it's my father.
I am slightly biased, but I did think that was a brilliant talk. But ignore the bias. And I was wanting to ask a question about what I think is a fantastic, enormous study, the wetland bird thing. I mean, it's such a superb study because it covers a wide range of areas in the world, types of bird and so on. And it's awfully disappointing, the graph you showed. I'm sure you have scratched your head as trying to drill down to the reasons for the failures. Can you explain what you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a fantastic question. So that global study, I mean, Dad said some very nice things there, which is very uncharacteristic from him. He's also a professor, so, you know, always living in his shadow. So the question is, that's a global study, quite disappointing results. You'll see a lot of red on that graph and an awful lot of grey and yellow on the graph, which meaning no impact at all. You must have scratched your head. Why is that happening? So first of all, I would answer by saying one of the real downsides of these global scale analysis is it's very hard to really drill into what's going on. There's a value of things at large scale, and they're the ones that get, that study was the front page of Nature last year, so it got very high profile attention because it's global. But actually those global scale studies don't give you the kind of the annoyance and the granularity that you can get from more fine scale studies. I actually examined a PhD last year from a guy called Sean Jellersmark at the University College London. Came out about, his PhD was about the same time as that paper came out, and his was looking at the UK scale. What's the impact of protected areas on waterbird populations? So exactly the same question, but within the UK. And he was able to drill down really carefully into what were the predictors of effectiveness within UK waterbird, the impact of UK protected areas on waterbirds. And it was things like predator controls, habitat condition, these kind of factors that were making the difference. Our global scale analysis, we tried very hard to do a secondary analysis to tease apart what predicts the blues, the reds and the greys, like what predicts a positive impact or a negative impact or no impact. And we threw everything at that model. The most important predictors that came out in that secondary analysis were size of protected areas, that came out as important, and our proxy for management effectiveness. But the only proxy we had was, is there a management plan for the protected area? That's all we had. So my overall kind of conclusion from all of that really is that the reason most of those, so many protected areas don't seem to be having a positive impact for waterbirds globally is that probably there is very limited management on the ground. There's very little done. Whereas where you've got protected areas with people actively managing, whether it's ensuring there's sufficient water in the wetland throughout the year, whether it's controlling predators, whatever it might be, that's where you're getting the positive impacts on trends in species populations.
I'm going to follow on actually with this. There's few questions we're going to get on with, but when you talk about the COP agreement, the 30-30, which is more about protecting areas, and I think I know that they are looking at which areas is it we want to protect, but is the message there, I mean, do you understand that there's going to be more plan to actively manage those protected areas based on your results then? Because it seems like that's required.
Oh, based on our results, absolutely.
Well,
we are influencing, no. We're part of a strong voice from conservation science. But yes, that is what we're trying to influence. Now, what's interesting is the 30 by 30 target is just the most recent in a series of targets. So back, if you remember the Aichi targets, so target 11 of the Nagoya, the Aichi Target Agreement for Nature, which was in 2010, 20 targets for nature by 2020 was the kind of headline. Target 11 of that was about protected areas. That was about increasing terrestrial protected areas to 18%. And the bit that always gets remembered is that area-based target, so the 18% from that target and the 30 by 30 from this target. But actually, even target 11 of the Aichi targets had a whole rest of the sentence, which was effective, well-connected, ecologically representative and equitably managed. Those words were already in there back in the actually target 11. And the 30 by 30, although it gets reported as an area-based target, everyone says 30% of the world conserved for nature by 2030. If you read it's target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the wording again is effectively, equitably managed. That's all in there. So at least in theory, the wording is there in the global policy that it has to be not just a line on a map, but effectively managed, equitably managed, ecologically representative, all of this. The problem is, drawing lines on maps is really easy to do. You just need a few workshops, somebody with a bit of GIS skill, and you draw a line on a map, and there you go. The politicians can stand up and pat themselves on the back and say, we've reached our global target, haven't we done well? Effective management is an awful lot more difficult, an awful lot more costly, and if we look at the state of UK's protected areas, you know, we can see the challenges. I happen to work in mostly Madagascar and other parts of the world. I don't happen to work in the UK, but you know, many of the challenges apply here just as much as they do elsewhere.
Okay, if it's okay, I'm going to move on to some of the questions posted on Slido then. So the first two ones are about skepticism, basically. So the first one is about the offsets, you know, when it is offered. So here there was a reference also to the carbon offset aspects, but here today we were introduced to the biodiversity offset. We already had quite an ongoing discussion on this with the UK and so on. But generally speaking, I mean, is it fair to be skeptical about it? So that's this one. And then there's another question kind of related as well about the COPs themselves and whether it's greenwashing kind of aspects or whether there is some real progress.
I'd love to hear Robbie's view on that as well. So I'll just start on the offsetting question. Is it fair to be skeptical? Absolutely. We should all be skeptical always. Well, I mean, I'm talking to quite a scientific audience. It's our job to be skeptical, to be critical, to weigh evidence. It was interesting when we went to first publish that paper showing that the Ambassador mine had achieved no net loss of forest. The amount of scrutiny that paper got in the peer review process, I mean, it's always hard to publish, but I think because it was such a positive result, the journal were really worried to check, you know, do they have any conflicts of interest? Because this obviously has a commercial benefit. You know, consultancies that are out there trying to sell their ability to do offsets can benefit from this paper. Everyone was very worried to check about our conflict of interest. I had a meal in the canteen of the mine, and I did hitch a lift once in a mine vehicle for a few kilometres on a road. But yeah, don't have any conflict of interest. But yes, it's fair to be skeptical, and my caveats are so important. Don't forget those caveats. I never talk about that paper without those caveats. They're so important, and we absolutely need to be skeptical. When biodiversity offsetting was first introduced in the UK back in 2012, there was the DEFRA pilot for offsetting. There was, at that stage, there was a huge amount of dislike, outward protest from the UK environmental movement, because it was being sold as a way of we can still do development without kind of nature and green stuff getting in the way. And it was the idea that, you know, it was being talked as if we could offset ancient woodlands, etc. At least now, in the current framing of the way the DEFRA metric works and the current biodiversity offsetting, that's been taken out completely. So irreplaceable habitats can't be offset. They can only be avoided. So at least there's progress in the policy. But yes, you're right to be skeptical, and we absolutely need environmentalists keeping a very close eye on this. The COP question, I'll let Robbie talk his view first on that, because I'd love to hear what he thinks. Well, how skeptical about you about COPs in general?
Very. But that's not to say that I think that they shouldn't happen. I think the fact that we keep. Can you all hear me?
No, use that. Use the microphone.
I think the fact that we keep this conversation going continuously, that there is a conference of the parties happening about climate change or biodiversity loss on such a regular basis internationally, and we are engaging politicians and making them come to some hard choices almost continuously is very important. I think the fact that that conversation is happening, the fact that that conversation remains in the press is very important. It keeps it at the forefront of our minds. The problem with that is that, unfortunately, it does mean that we all get bored of it to some extent. And quite honestly, sometimes I look at the news about the current conference of the parties that's taking place, and I am bored to tears by the conversations that are happening. But I think that the importance of the fact that it is happening should not be lost in our scepticism.
Yeah, so I'll focus particularly on the biodiversity COP. So there's these, for those who aren't so familiar with global environmental policy, Conference of the Parties just means the COP is where people come together, where the parties, the signatures to an international convention come together. So at the moment we're at COP28 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Last year it was COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the one that agreed that big framework that I mentioned. Biodiversity COPs happen much less often than the climate change ones, which I think is good because it makes us less bored for a start. So focusing on biodiversity COP, this global agreement that was signed last year means very little until it's translated into national policy, and then it can be used nationally by people to put pressure on their governments. So I think that's the process by which it's useful. So currently the UK is going through, so each signature to the Conference of Parties of the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, got an acronym soup here, has what's called an NBZAP. Won't tell you what that stands for. It's National Biodiversity Action Plan, essentially. That's the mechanism by which things happen nationally. So what gets written in the UK's NBZAP as a response to what happened in the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, that's where civil society in the UK can really put pressure on governments and say, this isn't good enough, or you haven't put this in your NBZAP, you have to. Or once it's in there, they can hold government to account on what's in that. So I think the international process has a role and has a process, particularly because for lower income countries, it can unlock international funding because agreements are made to support poorer countries in delivering on these conventions. But it's the national processes that actually matter. So if you are feeling a little bit kind of like yawning while watching the international news about what's going on, sort of, it is a process by which things get agreed, and then it's your own, using your democratic processes within your country, civil society, that actually makes a difference. But having countries signing up, politicians love signing things at international conventions. That then results in pressure locally. That's the mechanism why it should make a difference. Goodness, that was as boring an answer as the news about COP28. Sorry, Robbie.
Actually, this is quite a segue to two questions here, which is our role ourselves and holding the politicians to account. So there's two questions here. First of all, is considering the executive is beholden to the wishes of the electorate to an extent, how are we? How responsible are we for the lack of conservation and sustainability? So that's question one. This is us. Are we would like to put pressure on the politicians, but at the end of the day, when they promise a bit more money at the end of the month, which is what they focus on, we probably can forget the sustainability aspect. And then the second question, was, I may have lost it now. Well, let's go with this one then.
I'll go first, and then Rob, I'd love to hear your view. So environmental issues are a really difficult one because all of us, by living the lifestyle we live, and I fly more than many people because of the work I do working in the tropics, environmental issues are difficult because the environmental movement tells us that it's not all about individual action. We do need to be focusing on political change, but we can't wipe ourselves completely of all responsibility. As a society, we need to be willing to vote for politicians who are going to make changes that will maybe ultimately result in changes that will make certain things, make flying more expensive, for example. And I think those of us that work on environmental issues do have to do a bit of soul searching around these difficult questions around, trade-offs that really do affect decision making. But the evidence, I'd like to hear Robbie's view. Go on, Robbie, you go ahead. I'd like to hear what your view is on that.
This has actually been a topic of conversation in the past couple of days in my household. I recently went on a holiday, and it was a holiday. I got on a flight and flew to Tenerife for 2 weeks, and had a holiday. That is the first time in 13 years that I've done that, where I've not actually been flying to do some work or not actually been flying to go and visit people that I would otherwise wouldn't have been able to visit. And I had a bit of a meltdown about this after the fact. I thought it was a good idea at the time, and it was definitely good for my mental state to go on a holiday. One of the things that I very often say to people when asked questions about personal responsibility and political responsibility is that we all have personal responsibility for biodiversity and the climate. And one of those personal responsibilities is that we should not waste anything. One of those personal responsibilities that we should vote. And so in both scenarios, it does fall down to us as individuals to make choices about the way that we want this world to be. And I think that that's what it comes down to for me, is that very much this is about personal responsibility, even if the politicians are the ones that are making those decisions at higher levels. We're the ones that are, luckily for us in Britain, we are the ones that are putting the politicians into those positions. There are countries in the world that don't have that luxury and aren't able to take that personal responsibility.
Yeah, vote. That's my answer to everything about, yeah. Be aware of the policies of the people you're voting for. Yeah.
There are loads of questions, and they're all very good. So I don't know how much time we have left. One actually is directly related back to the talk. So
okay.
Let's go back to this one. Wildfire and land management. Can you please repeat your inference and conclusion, and how confident are your conclusions based on 1 year of data? Do you remember?
Yep. Okay, so she's referring to the study by Eklund et al. Looking at using the COVID lockdowns as a kind of quasi-experiment to look at the impact that normal management of protected areas is having on fires in Madagascar's protected areas. So yeah, absolutely. It's, as I've said, a counterfactual is always unknowable. So what we're trying to do in all the 4 case studies I showed, I was trying to use different ways of getting at this unknowable counterfactual. So what we were trying to get at there was we were using the COVID lockdowns to say, what would happen if protected area management just stopped? Because effectively it did just stop for a few months. But we couldn't just look at what happened in terms of burning, because fires vary from year to year. So that's why we built that model to predict how many fires would have expected to happen given the climate that there had been in 2020, which was different from the climate in previous years. So we're building on, it's 20 years, I think, of fire and rainfall and climate data to build the model, but then we're just looking in 1 year. Now, we absolutely can't completely conclude that it's the change in management that caused that peak in burning. It could have been people are seeing what's happening to the economy of Madagascar, the country is closed down, people are thinking, okay, I'm currently dependent on tourism, or I run a little shop, or whatever it might be. That economic activity is not going to be happening for the near future because of lockdowns and the economy going into free fall. Therefore, I'm going to return to agriculture. And it was actually an increase in sort of demand, in pressure on farming, rather than the reduction in the management that was the change. Now, the reason we don't think that's the case is because of how quickly those fires stopped the minute normal management returned, even though the economy hadn't yet recovered. But absolutely, it's circumstantial. We're piecing that story together from the best evidence we've got at the time. Yeah, the counterfactual is unknowable. You know, we can't do an experiment. We can't say, right, we're going to just withdraw all management from this random allocated proportion of Madagascar's protected areas and carry on as normal in the others. That would be completely unethical as well as unpractical.
Okay, so kind of following on with methodology that you were hinting at the end that you want the study design and things like this. So I guess this question will be more on the UK side, but perhaps not. How do policymakers decide the baseline for biodiversity that offsetting tries to meet? So I know you had your graph, didn't you? But then the second question is this baseline actually biodiverse enough?
Well, that's touching at the whole idea of shifting baselines. So we're living in an incredibly nature-depleted world. So where should we be trying to get back to? You know, what is the baseline? The kind of the buzzword on the international conservation kind of street is bending the curve on biodiversity and being nature positive by 2030. So the focus is recognizing that we've got this decline and we need to reverse the decline and make the state of nature better. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we compare what we've lost over the last, you know, whatever time periods we use, last 30 years, last 20 years, nature is in ongoing decline.
Okay. How much time do we have? 8 minutes. Okay, fantastic. Loads of questions. Right. Another question which you didn't touch upon, or kind of halfway, but perhaps you know of both of you, perhaps, or perhaps you don't. How does marine conservation compare to on-land conservation? Do you have any idea whether the impacts observed, is there any differences as far
I have
as you
this
know?
rule that I don't do marine.
Okay.
So I'm just going to say I'm not answering that. That's my one thing. If it's a paper, if it's a grant, if it's a collaboration, if it's marine, I don't do it. I like swimming in the sea, but nothing else. So unless Robbie has anything to say, we'll move on. I don't do marine.
And I'm also not a marine
Okay.
person.
We're not the people to answer.
That's fine. We'll move on then, because there's a question which is kind of Welsh-oriented. I think it's, when I say First Min, it's going to be First Minister? Okay.
Yes,
Okay. First Minister of Wales used Future Generation Bill in his rejection of the M4 Relief Road in Newport. You're all nodding,
Yep.
so you seem to know what it is. Citing biodiversity loss. And the question is, what about legislation in the rest of the UK? Are you...
So one thing, I keep jumping in first. Robbie, you go first on this one.
I'm going to say I love the fact that in Wales we were the first country in the world to have a Future Generations Act, to consider the impact of what we do now on the generations that there are to come, and to leave a world in a better state for those generations. I think that that's a really positive move, because it sets into Welsh legislation something that then has the impact of guiding all other legislation in Wales. We don't have the luxury in Wales of being able to set legislation across everything that affects Wales, but we do have the luxury of being able to set legislation that affects some of what goes on in Wales. And so where we can have impact in Wales, this Future Generations Bill, the Future Generations Act, is directly impacting decisions that are being made. So that's the first thing that I would say. That act of the Senedd has had an impact in other countries, not just the devolved nations of the United Kingdom of Britain and Northern Ireland, but it has had an impact internationally, and there are other countries around the world that are building legislation around how we leave the earth for future generations. And I think the fact that Wales has led the way on that one is probably the most tremendous thing and something that Wales should be very, very proud of. And the fact that it has directly impacted the decisions in Wales to not build any new roads. Having said that, one of the things that we aren't able to legislate for in Wales is legislation around public transport. And so this legislation that has impacted us not being able to build new roads has not automatically enabled us to put further investment into public transport, which would then counter that. So we're not in the perfectly strong position that we should be surrounding that legislation, and that is a slight disappointment on my behalf.
I don't think I need to add anything. That was well covered.
Okay.
Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is a interesting piece of legislation.
I think we're going to have one more question. Okay, just one more. So that's the biggest one. Are you optimistic for global biodiversity recovery over the next 100 years? At least we give you a time scale.
100 years, that's generous. That's very generous. I always get that question. I'm a very optimistic person. And there's a bit of a hesitation. As I say, that's why I added the slide about the thing that does give me hope. You know, I'm faced every day with students here in the UK and students that I work with, particularly in Madagascar, who do genuinely give me hope. And I feel like we must be getting to some kind of a turning point in terms of things come in cycles. Things are going bad, things are going to get better. So I think I'm feeling positive. I'm a bit of a techno-optimist. You know, I do believe that technology is going to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, and there's going to be changes in agriculture that mean that we need less land. And those things, I think, are positive. So I'm going to end on yes, I am optimistic. There are challenges, though, but I do see increases in civil society support for nature conservation here in the UK and internationally, wherever I work.
Do you want to say something as well, Robbie?
Yeah, I do. I'm completely with Julia on that. One of the things that Julia and I work on every year, Julia asks me to get involved in the Welcome Week walk for the new intake of undergraduate students at Bangor University. And we go on this amazing walk around an amazing lake near where we live called Llyn Padarn in North Wales. And I get to see those new intake of students in their first week of their new lives. And what an amazing group of people they are. And if that's where the future sits, not just the future of conservation and ecology, but if those young people are where the future of our politics and our agriculture and the wider world sits, then actually I'm feeling positive.
And I'm sure Manchester students are just as fab.
I think so too. Are we coming to a close? Yes, so I'm just going to summarize, I think, a tiny bit where we've gone here today. But, you know, we've learned a lot via Julia's talk and the Q&A about the politics around it and how also as citizens we need to push a bit more for this and put everybody accountable. But we need to keep a very healthy skepticism. But it seems to me I didn't really know that the study design aspect, it seems that we need to have some really proper science to evaluate properly the impact of all our actions and actually before. Offsetting, clearly very context dependent. Yeah, some people, we have to be very mindful of those SDGs and, you know, they are deforesting the land for making a livelihood, so we need to give them other options, I guess. But here in the UK, we need to put pressure on very different systems and getting the private sectors to pay a bit more, perhaps also. So there's quite a lot here of a mixed picture, and then hopefully you will, well, we need to get the small prints in, don't you? This effective protection of the areas needs to be implemented following some science, isn't it? So you have gathered quite a lot of global data evidence, which is really nice to kind of say, this is where it needs to go. So hopefully, are you influential? Hopefully you are very influential.
Not at all.
But I guess we all need to become a bit more influential here by listening, by reading, and keeping the conversation alive without being boring. So this is where the young people can help a lot as well, I believe, with that. Their energy and enthusiasm, getting everybody involved as part of our everyday life, besides the global challenges. Biodiversity might look quite different in 100 years. It might still be there, just looking very different potentially, isn't it? Hopefully there's some kind of summary for this, but I really want to thank Julia and also Robbie for coming here today. And we have this nice certificate to give you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Certificate. Thank you.
Are we going to take a picture? So now there's going to be a reception in the hall with some food, isn't it? food and drinks. So we'll invite you all to go to the hall, and we'll join you there for further conversations. Yeah. Yes? Are you not going to take a picture? You're not taking a picture?
As well, if that's okay.